Hello and welcome to Behind the Bearcat. This is the podcast where the Northwest Missouri State University Career Services Office chats with Northwest faculty, staff, students, alumni, and friends to hear about their career journeys, how they got to where they are, and how they became Bearcats. I'm Career Services Assistant Director Travis Klein.
And I'm Hannah Christian, the Director of Career Services here at Northwest. And today's guest on our show, I always like to give a little drum roll, is...
Hello, my name is Bray, and I'm a assistant professor of graphic design at Northwest.
Welcome.
Britton. First of all, Britton is the coolest name ever. So
Thank you so much.
I love it.
Yeah, it's got the alliteration with my last name, which
I know.
is always
you
fun.
got
Always
that going
awesome.
on.
Yes.
So you are new professor this semester. So I often talk to people and kind of go back to the beginning of their journey, but I would like to today start with the present moment and work our way back in time, if
Sure.
you don't mind.
Yeah.
Since you've just gone through the interview, like finding a job, like searching for a job, finding a job, applying for a job, interviewing for a job, and everything that goes with that. So if you would, can you tell us a little bit about this time around, how you found Northwest and kind of the application process through interview process that got you here?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Because when I started interviewing for universities, I didn't realize that it was a little bit different from interviewing for some other jobs that I've had, some design jobs, for example. So the first thing I did when I was starting my search for universities was just doing a lot of research on what do positions look like. I've never taught at a university before, so it was all very new to me. I was looking at like tenureship positions and the difference between that and what are they called?
Like an instructor or a lecturer position?
Yeah, like a lecturer or instructor or a part-time adjunct was what I was thinking of, the adjunct positions. Because the difference between teaching full-time and teaching part-time is usually can you sustain yourself on you can't really sustain yourself easily teaching adjunct. So there's a lot of benefits that you get from a tenureship on top of the whole research aspect, which was really exciting for me.
So where did you find the job like posting? Where were you looking maybe? And where did you
Oh,
find it?
yeah. I was looking everywhere, but for university positions, higher ed, I think it's higher ed jobs or just highered.com was where I found a majority of positions online, and that's usually where I found the most information.
Did you apply through that one or did you like go to the university websites and
Pretty
apply
much
there?
higher ed just had the job postings, and then I would have to go to each individual website for each university and then do their usually very long application process. But that's important if they're hiring a professor to be really thorough. So I wasn't really complaining too much about it because it meant that, when I got to the interview point, they already knew a lot about me.
So how many in this job search process, how many applications did you put out there?
For universities, I probably applied to around 8, I think. I started a little bit later in the process. Usually positions start opening at the end of the year and then we'll go on through the summer. But by the time, July hits, they start kind of decreasing in number. And so I started a little bit later in March, uh, and applied to a bunch of positions. I had 3 separate interviews, and then 2 interviews where I actually traveled to campuses, including Northwest, which obviously worked out. And I'm really glad it did because I was looking at places all over the country, but I'm from Missouri. I was living in Kansas City, and so the location here is amazing because I can still visit my family, and also I just really like Missouri.
So did you travel like far away to do other interviews, like
Yeah,
fly places?
the other place I interviewed was in Louisiana, which was very far away, and it was also very humid. Um, so I like that I landed in the Midwest because it's home to me.
No hurricanes here either, so that's a bad
No,
bonus.
we do get tornadoes,
Yes, we
but
do. We can.
that's normal part of
Right.
life.
So you
Go
mentioned
ahead,
being from
Travis.
Kansas City. Can you kind of tell us maybe a little bit about your background, maybe like where you went to school and kind of before you came to Northwest and before you started this application process? Like, how did you
Sure.
get to be a professor in the first place?
Yeah, so I'm originally from St. Louis. And that's I went to school there in Webster Groves and Kirkwood. If you gone to those schools, you know they have a big rivalry. So I was on both sides. And I didn't actually start being interested in art until I was kind of midway through high school when I realized, like, wait a minute, this is like a really fun thing to do. I didn't really have any other career ambitions. And I was like, okay, well, I have a lot of fun doing this thing. I wonder if I could turn that into a career. And I saw that different program, like all the art programs that existed, and I became interested in that. But I didn't really realize how much I loved talking about art until I went to grad school. Well, even in my undergrad, I went to University of Central Missouri, so in Warrensburg, which is also relatively in the same area. Um, my favorite thing was critiques, where you get to talk about art, talk about your art, talk about other people's art. And even though I was a really shy person at that point, it was the only time where I felt comfortable talking. But I didn't really make the connection. It's like, wait a minute, teaching is just talking about art. Uh, but then when I graduated in 2020 in the pandemic, which was not fun. Uh, it was rough because no one was really hiring designers at that point. And so I kind of was doing random commissions and other part-time jobs. And then after a year, I was like, well, I was actually invited by a friend who I graduated with in undergrad, Cindy Cherpick, who is also an amazingly talented illustrator, and I think she's teaching at the Art Institute in Kansas City right now. She said, "Hey, check out this program. This is where I went to grad school. You may like it." And I checked it out at Washington University in St. Louis, and it was really a great program. And I learned a lot, especially about how how to like think more thoroughly about art and discuss it in a more academic setting, and how that to apply that to your own work. And so, yeah, that's when I realized, yeah, I want to be a professor. I want to be a teacher.
So, can we go back a little bit? So, you got a BFA, correct? Could you
Correct.
explain to our viewers the difference between a BA and a BFA? People may not know that the difference there.
Yeah, a BFA is a Bachelor of Fine Art. So for me, my degree is Bachelor of Fine Art, illustration. So that was sort of my emphasis. Which for a lot of schools, that's how it works. Other have like dedicated programs, like Northwest has a dedicated graphic design program. And there may be like other topics that are explored in classes, but a BFA is specifically for fine art.
So, I think I want to emphasize this point. You're graduating with a BFA in pandemic times. This is a little bit of a bleak outlook. So, I feel like thinking back 4 years ago. So, what was your sort of thought process? I imagine a lot of terror maybe around like trying to find a job or trying to get some sort of income coming in or trying to figure out what you're going to do with your life at that moment in time. Can you take us back there and kind of walk us through your thought process?
Sure. So luckily, I had a really great professor who honestly is one of my biggest inspirations for teaching in general in my methodology and how I want to do it. John Malta, who is an extremely talented illustrator. He's recently moved on from University of Central Missouri to be I think like a coordinator for a art school in California. I don't remember the exact name. But he told us how after he graduated grad school, he worked in an ice cream shop for a few years while he was building up his client base. And he didn't say that, that was necessarily a bad thing. He had a stable job and he was able to work on his art on the side, and that was okay. So even though I didn't get an art job right off the bat, I knew that it takes time to really find a good place to land your career, especially if you want to make your own work, as opposed to, working in a marketing firm, which is also totally valid. But in 2020, no one was really marketing events anymore. Uh, so there weren't many of those jobs either. In fact, a lot of companies were decreasing their designers because they didn't have work for them. So even though I graduated into, working at retail and doing random commissions on the side, I wasn't too distraught because I knew it was just going to be a lot of time and work until I get to a place where I want to be, where I am
Did you
now.
did you know so you already had kind of teaching in mind, like right out of the bat? I guess my question was Did you know that you didn't want to go maybe into the corporate design or commercial design or agency design side? Like, you already knew that prior
Yeah.
to graduating?
Yeah, my biggest love has always been comics and storytelling. Any sort of way to tell a story, an illustration, or even in graphic design, you're still evoking emotion. And, in my opinion, some of the strongest designs and graphics that exist are making you feel something, getting an emotional connection. And a lot of corporate work, personally, I don't has that same connection. Some of them do. But for the most part, I've always loved work that emphasizes the individual style of each designer. And so that was the work I really wanted to pursue eventually. I didn't know how long it would take me to get to that point. But grad school is one of the things that taught me about the different aspects of the design world and how to pursue each one.
What are some of the classes you mentioned? Graphic design is a specific program here at Northwest. So, what are some of those classes that those your students are taking with you here at Northwest?
Yeah, right now I am teaching four studio classes, technically a fifth, which I'll explain. So, some of the classes I'm taking that are graphic design focused are Advanced Digital Art Studio, which is kind of a long word salad for, advancing knowledge in design programs like Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator and InDesign, or whatever other programs that people are drawing with. On top of that, I'm also teaching digital photography, which is a freshman level course, which is just going over, the basics of how to take photos, how to think about design through photos, because a lot of graphic design integrates photography in some way, or, any sort of art really can find ways to integrate photography. And then I am teaching package design, which is also really fun because we get to analyze, what's the mentality going into how something is designed, how you're selling it to someone, different markets. And that kind of goes back to the storytelling aspect. And then the last class I'm teaching is illustration, which is really fun because we get to do a lot of more experimental work in there, and that's where I find people grow the most as designers is when they're trying really weird and interesting things and seeing what works and what doesn't. And then the last sort of studio class I'm teaching is design studio, which is more of a one-on-one portfolio development class for seniors to develop kind of their own design voice in a more individual care setting. So, and that's really great because I get to talk to individual students about, what kind of work do they want to make? What kind of designer do they want to be? And you get to see a lot more personality shine through than with other projects.
Can you talk to us about this? Is so interesting because you did some freelance work before you came here, right? Can you talk to me about I know a lot of students who might want to do whether it's art or maybe it's social media management or maybe it's marketing who want to do some freelance projects on the side. How should they approach that?
Yeah, the biggest thing with freelance is talking to people, getting to know people, waiting for someone to message you on social media, be like, hey, I want you to draw this for me. That happens, but it's not a way of building a client base. And there's also the more casual form of freelance where you are talking online and finding jobs on the internet, talking to communities. Like I got a lot of my freelance jobs because I knew someone in the music industry who was making lo-fi music. And I got in contact with other musicians through that and other companies through that. And because I was making album art for Spotify or on YouTube. And so people just kept on talking about, oh, this person makes art. You can hire them to make your art. And so it's really word of mouth a lot of times. But then when you're looking at more professional, higher level freelance where you're doing work for magazines and newspapers like New York Times, that is a whole nother thing where like sending emails, sending mailers, like postcards with your art. Uh, I haven't really pursued that as much because it seems right now it's kind of a big thing to invest time and money into, getting a giant list of art directors and sending your work to. So, but right now I'm happy to just be having my word of mouth jobs come in, but I'll probably be pursuing more jobs like that in the future because it just takes a lot of time.
Mhm.
Like you don't get to work full-time freelance right off the bat. It can take years to build up a client base. And it's really just having that motivation and understanding that it'll take time to become successful at it.
Yeah, I would think it's
Mm.
just marketing. Like the product
Yeah.
is you and your work, but you still got to market it just like if you were trying to sell what it like it's all just marketing. So it's like it all goes in
Yes.
together and it's I think that's the thing when I've talked to students about freelance work and doing things like that, they don't like the idea of selling themselves and trying to get their work like that. That's not attractive to them. And it's like, well, freelance work might not be for you because that's really it's what you're doing. Like that, you're always trying to get someone to buy your product, and your product happens to be your work. And that's maybe it'd be better if you got a job where you didn't have to do the selling, you just did the work that you enjoy instead of trying
But
to
that's
sell it.
literally what
So
getting a job is.
I
If I
know it
had to
is,
say
but you're
anything,
always
getting a
doing it.
job is selling yourself.
Right, but it's so
Yes.
short term. I think that's sometimes the attractiveness of the freedom of freelance, I think, attracts students. But when it's like, well, it's like job searching, but it's after every little job. Like instead of one assignment at a job and then you get your next, it's like, well, now you got to apply for another. It's a
Yeah.
constant cycle, and it's a lot of work. I mean, and you
Yeah,
have
it's
to
a lot
be
of work
mentally
and
prepared.
yeah, and there's a lot of risk factor in that
Hmm.
you have to pay for your own insurance
Yep.
and you don't really have any benefits. My brother is a freelance musician and he's very successful at it, but he has to go through a lot of the same challenges of being a
Hmm.
uh freelance career of, he has to constantly be looking for new jobs, and constantly contacting people and talking about his own work and talking about other people's work. And the thing is that even if you don't want to necessarily sell your work to the man or whatever that, you'll still meet a lot of cool people who are just
Hmm.
interested in your work for being your work. You're not selling out just by getting your work in front of more people. It's really just finding the right people to sell your work to.
Hmm.
And knowing, like you said before, Travis, like talking about your work, knowing how to talk about your work and talk about the value of it, because everyone's work does have inherent value. That's something I really strongly believe is that all art has inherent value to it by being made by a human being. That's such a unique aspect of art. Uh, and that's also practicing critiques, practicing how to talk about your own work is extremely important.
So you mentioned that you liked critiques. I also like critiques. Some students might be afraid of critiquing work. Any sort of like tips or tricks you could give a student or someone who's, maybe interested in this type of path to help them feel a little less scared of talking about work or critiquing work, or maybe not feeling personally criticized by what's going on in that type of situation?
Yeah, that's a really, really good thing to talk about because it is natural for someone to be really attached to the work that they make. That is totally normal. It's a part of making art is to feel some sort of emotional and personal attachment to the things you make. And then to have that be talked about and talked about its flaws and can be a super emotional process. And the first thing I would say is that that's totally normal to feel that way. But you learn the most by having other people talk about your work and talking about other people's work, getting feedback, learning how to improve. And so you do have to have a sort of emotional disconnect of, okay, I'm making this thing to improve, and I need to get advice on how to improve it so that I can be a better artist and make even better work. So my biggest thing is just try to come into critiques with that mentality that it's okay if you make something and it doesn't work out exactly as you planned. I would rather a student take risks and try new things that may not work out than to just do whatever they consider safe every project. Because the safe student just will not learn as much and won't improve as much as the person who's trying things and accepting criticism and understanding that is just a part of the improvement process.
That's so good. Taking risks. I think that applies not just to that type of critique piece, but also across the board in terms of like playing it safe by going to class, playing it safe by only, looking for opportunities in an area where you feel comfortable, right? Like you have to put some risk into this process to make it, worth the return on what you're attempting to do.
Hmm.
And you talk about getting your work in front of people. It's always surprised me when I as a maker am attached to something or I see it in a specific way and then you put it up in front of someone else And the responses are often you're like, "What?" Like, I did not get that out of that, right? So, it's always an interesting, I think, exercise in terms of seeing what people are projecting onto what work you're making or seeing how they respond to your sort of, like, making or the work that you've done. That's always an interesting
Yeah, other
perspective
people getting
taking.
different interpretations than maybe even what you intended is great. And that's the other thing is that, some people may have the incorrect interpretation or they may not like your work, and then you just have to accept that's not really a valid criticism. I mean, someone can not like my work, and I'm okay with that. But if they don't like it, just like I don't like this color and it's terrible, and that's why I don't like it. Well, that's not useful criticism.
Right.
Uh, and you just have to accept that as for what it is. But accept useful criticism
Mhm.
if people are trying to add on to like what themes and things you're trying to talk about, and they're already and they're talking about that as well, they understand what you're trying to do, and they're wanting to help you do that even better.
Well, I
Yeah,
think
that's a
that's
good
a
point.
good professional skill for any area. Being able to take constructive criticism is, if you're an accountant, whatever your product that you put out is, like, you are going to at some point in your career receive constructive criticism and non-constructive criticism, but you've got to be able to take the constructive stuff and move forward with it. So I think for your students, even if they end up working outside of the world of art, going through that critique process, understanding what it's about is valuable for any industry. So that's really cool. You mentioned, I wanted to go circle back. You mentioned teaching digital art. Um, do you think that, like, the rise of iPads and the Apple Pencil and the ease at which, I feel like the barrier to entry at digital art is a lot lower now than it used to be, because it used to be super expensive and people, it was not easy to make digital art. And now, a couple hundred
Used to
bucks
be
you can
Paint,
have, yeah, you can have
baby.
a
We make
really nice
pixelated,
setup
ugly
and
things
do,
on Paint.
a Procreate license, and you can make professional level work, pretty quickly. Does that made students better prepared, or has it not helped? I'm curious about, your perspective on that. Is it a good thing to have all that access to it, or would you rather it be they learn the fundamentals and then they jump into that kind of digital world, or does it matter?
I think there's benefits and some detriments to that. I mean, I really love how accessible digital art has become. It's not messy. You just need to buy the one thing. I
Mhm.
mean, you buy some sort of tablet and then you buy a Procreate license, which I don't know what it is these days. I bought it for 20 bucks and I haven't had to pay anything since. Um, and when I was in high school, I bought, a secondhand drawing tablet, but even that was like pretty expensive to get and used random free drawing programs before upgrading to things like Photoshop. So, and the reason why is because digital art is so common on the internet these days. You see it constantly. That's how I became an artist and became inspired was seeing all this digital art because it became more accessible. And that's even more the case now. But I do think that there is sort of a problem where people come in and be digital artists. They see these amazing curated uh, websites and social media accounts, and they're like, man, this person is so good. I want to draw art just like them. Or they think, oh man, my art is never going to be that good. They get this sort of false idea of what digital art is supposed to be because you can do the foundational aspects in digital art. You can start with the very basics of working with shape and line and uh, anything that you're making in a foundational 2D class. But people don't understand that's part of the process, and they just want to jump right into like making something super stylized and beautiful. When that is just not how the process is. You got to make a lot of weird and foundation, like you got to make a lot of weird art. You got to also cover all the foundations. I became a much better artist when I started studying more basic anatomy and not just trying to draw cartoon characters by imagining what their anatomy is going to look like, for example.
Hmm. That's okay. So that moves into another sort of space. You were talking about research, right? Can you tell us a little bit about creative research and how that kind of contributes to the educational process of an art student?
Yes. So my grad school, the program that I went to was illustration and visual culture. And when I first entered the program, I didn't really understand what visual culture was. I mean, I could guess based off of the term itself, but what I realized was that no art exists in a vacuum. Everything has some sort of visual history attached to it, whether intentional or not. So, and other people will associate visual culture to your work, whether you intend to or not. And so, for example, I've been kind of doing a lot of visual research currently into anime art styles and what exactly are the traits that make something anime? Like, how do we associate that in our mind? And it's the
Mm.
same thing with portraiture, with referencing any sort of vintage illustration style, like Art Deco or, minimalist art. Everything is a reference to something because we exist surrounded by images every single day, and our creative mind is influenced by those images, whether we like it or not. So it's much better for students to start thinking about, okay, how is my art referencing visual culture, and how can I do that purposefully? Especially in design studio, part of the aspect of that class is research, where students are making these larger projects that they get to choose, and then they have to do some sort of research on top of that. So, for example, I have a student who is interested in doing wedding design and wedding graphic design. It's like, okay, how did when were invitations even invented? When did that start being a thing?
Mm.
Why do wedding graphics look like that? And so doing research on why something looks the way it does can make your work even stronger and better because you start doing more things intentionally.
That was such a good way of explaining it. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and how I'm really excited. I'm pretty busy right now, but I'm really excited to pursue more avenues of research for my own work. And,
So what would that
during
be? Well, like, give us an example of that for you.
I haven't really decided yet. For my thesis in grad school, I talked about the relationship of female characters in American comics throughout history, both from like female creators, but mostly through characters and how they were written and how they were depicted. And I thought that was really interesting. And I feel like I could even though I wrote a thesis paper on that, I feel like I could talk even more about that and get more into the nitty-gritty details of why were women depicted in certain ways and how does that relate to other mass media of how we represent people and how do we fall into negative tropes and writing styles because it's something that we're talking about a lot with media these days of bad representation versus good representation. And that's really important if you're making any story with characters is representation. But also people tend to overthink it and then do whatever the safest thing is for them, which usually means, if you're a white creator, you may be just like not including anyone who you don't know how to write. So, which is a way of making your story and your world not have a lot of depth. So that's one thing that I'm really interested in. I'm also really interested in, like I said, in anime because that is such an influential medium for me. Um, but people don't really want to talk about it academically. They consider it,
Mm.
oh, well, it's not a serious subject, but it's not. It's a giant form of media that is super influential. Like some of the most best-selling comics in America are Japanese comics, for example. And I want to talk about how that relationship between, Japanese storytelling media and American storytelling media, and what sort of things do they have similar? Like, how are they talking to each other as like, because there's a lot of inspiration that goes back and forth. And also, what are some of the negative things that we share with each other? And how does like our art relate to each other? A lot of people will be like, "Oh, well, that's an anime art style," and they say that's a negative thing. It's like, why do we have negative associations with that? So I think that's interesting. I want to figure out a way to talk about that academically as well and seriously because I think it's a valid, serious topic to do research in.
Hmm.
What are some of your recommendations for comics for maybe people? I love comics and I've read them for
Oh
years. What are some
gosh.
of the ones you would recommend that are like the works everyone should kind of essential comics maybe?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I'm looking at my bookshelf, which is right in front of me, with probably over 100 different graphic novels on it. If you're looking for really comprehensive and interesting worlds, I would say for like a wider story, Full Metal Alchemist is a Japanese manga series. It was also made into an animation, but the series itself is talks about like very serious themes and is a an amazing comprehensive story of start to finish. It is just excellent. Um, and a lot of stories will kind of have like a lull, but that one is just really overall fantastic with great sort of character arcs going on. For sort of standalone stories, one of the most influential books on me was Nimona by N.D. Stevenson, which was also recently made into a Netflix movie adaptation,
Hmm.
which changed the story a little bit. But the main story itself is super sophisticated with its themes, but it's still made for younger audiences to talk about themes of identity, of relationships, of what it means to be a villain and what it means to be a hero, and how do you associate yourself with those labels. So if you're looking for just a really solid story that you can also share with your kids, that's a great place to start.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, my kids are very into that. They know all of the things. I I I am I feel like all of that has sort of exploded, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years. Kind of, there was a little bit of like anime sort of like counterculture, but then it's really become a mainstream, like you said, like there's Netflix adaptations of so many of the anime like storylines and characters, and like it's become really this sort of cultural phenomenon, which I think you mentioned. It's interesting in that sort of like fusion way, right? So like anime as it was, right? Then comes and then it becomes a whole cultural that goes back to the visual culture aspect of your program, right? Like
Yeah.
that's that's a like almost purely visual culture like interest there. And
Yeah,
I just
and
that is so interesting.
yeah, and I have students who obviously really love anime, and that's a huge part of their artistic influence, and I don't want to ignore that, just because people don't want to talk about it seriously. I want to be like, okay, let's talk about this through an academic lens of what aspects of this aesthetic and these art styles do you like, do you appreciate, and how can you talk about that and figure out how you're using those influences in your work.
Mhm. Hmm. So good. As you're teaching students and kind of guiding them through like creating portfolios and preparing them to go out and interview for positions or do freelance work, like what kind of tips or tricks or advice would you give them in terms of job searches, interviews, those types of things?
I would definitely say, I mean, one thing that was beneficial for me is practicing in front of friends, in front of family, because I was such a nervous interviewer. Um, Especially when I was doing all day interviews for universities. When I first started doing it, I was so nervous, but really it's getting practice of learning how to talk confidently is really essential.
Okay, can we
Um,
have a hold on? Can we have a pause here? So nobody knows this except for me and Britton because I was in Britton's interview, and the part of Britton's interview here that I was in, can you kind of, like just tell a brief little mini story because it went horribly awry.
oh gosh, yeah, it went so bad. So I was going to be part of my interview was doing a little demonstration on Adobe Illustrator, how I would teach doing a demo in Illustrator, because that's an important part of teaching art is teaching students how to use programs. And so I designed this whole Illustrator demo. I practiced it a bunch of times, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna nail this. And I went into the class and set it all up. And then first, all of the computers were Macs, and I was like not quite as comfortable on Macs as I was on Windows. I'm always been a Windows person, and so I had to remember. And some of the keybinds are slightly different in Illustrator, and so that was fun. And then also the projector was delayed by like 10 seconds. And I didn't realize it till I was a solid halfway through the demonstration because I was looking at my screen and saying, and I was like focused on drawing and talking at the same time. And then I looked up on the projector and I realized like, oh, the things I'm saying are not lining up with what other people are looking at. And I was like, oh no, I'm talking nonsense because it just wasn't useful at all. Um, But luckily it still went okay, and the projector issue did get fixed. And so now my demonstrations are on time, but I just kind of had to roll with the punches on that one because oh yeah, also the projector wouldn't turn on for I had it like a solid 40 minutes before the demo and I was like, all right, I'm gonna practice. Nope. The whole 40 minutes was just trying to get the projector to turn on. Turns out there was a switch on the wall no one knew about.
Mhm.
It was fine.
The projector pretty much had it out for you. Like, it was not
Yeah.
going to work. It was just like, "No, I'm not doing this today."
Yeah, it was rough, but it worked out. And I think everyone there had some good humor about it.
But that goes to say, like, you're going through the interview process and things will go wrong. Like, things
Mhm.
will go awry, and
Well,
just to
your
be able
interview
to,
went
like,
wrong when we interviewed
my
you for the
interview went
for
wrong. I know,
assistant
I had the
director.
job too. It went so wrong, and I practiced as well. I practiced, I set everything up, and then it was just like, it went downhill.
Mhm.
But but those situations where you can approach, like, the technical difficulties of teaching or of interviewing with, like, grace, right? That's a testament to, when you're teaching in front of a classroom, the technology sometimes might not work, right? You can't rely solely on this, like, prescripted thing to be the thing that you have to teach for that day. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt your answer, but I
No,
just
that's a good thing to keep in mind. I mean, it's good for any job really, learning how to deal with sudden issues, but really the most important thing when interviewing is being able to talk about yourself and your work
Mhm.
with confidence. Understand that you do have value and your work has value and that you have a lot to bring to the table. And those are really the biggest things.
And I think a lot of times how you react to that adversity is a benefit. It seems like when you're in the moment and the projector's 10 seconds off and you're freaking out, you're screaming on the inside, but as long as you keep your composure and like I say with Hannah's interview, we did it in the president's conference room and there was Last Supper
40
style, all of
people.
us on a
Yeah.
table, and then her camera quit working, but she reacted really well and had such grace that when we were talking about who we should hire, it's like, well, people are going to perform when they're at their best. But how do people perform when things aren't going their way and when things are just a disaster? Do they keep their composure? Do they still have they're still on even though they're freaking out, and I think that was certainly not a thing that hurt you when we did your interview, Hannah. So I think that does make a difference sometimes too, is even though it seems like in the moment like, oh my god, this is the worst thing that's ever happened, it might be what gets you the job. You never know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I always try to
go
sorry,
ahead.
I always try to approach it with humor where
Hmm.
like I don't remember exactly what my reaction it was when I realized the projector wasn't working, but I was probably like, well, that's not intended,
Hmm.
and just try to go with the flow and maybe make some awkward jokes about it, but and just keep on going.
And in that situation, the irony was that the computer screen itself was actually big enough that we could just watch it
Yeah.
on the computer. We didn't really need the projector, so we were just like, "Ah, we'll just do that." But back to the sort of scenario is that you can write on a piece of paper all day like, "I'm pretty good under pressure," right? Or like in a high pressure situation, like I feel pretty confident to manage a high pressure situation. But to actually demonstrate it in the interview or to for them to be able to see that rather than to, you having to explain it, I think really makes a big difference.
Yeah, especially in teaching because things can definitely
Yep.
go wrong. I had things go wrong this week. I had a project due and students had to use the printers and I didn't realize they didn't have access to the right printer for that and I just
Ah.
assumed they did. And so, a lot of them came into class with either they found some obscure alternative method or they just didn't have it because they couldn't find a reason. And that wasn't their fault. And it wasn't necessarily my fault either. Um, and so I was like, okay, I had to think on my feet, like, okay, how do I solve this? It's like, okay, I'll give you over the weekend to return it in, and we're just gonna start talking about the next project. But we're just gonna like find a quick solution. Okay, here's what the problem is. Everyone seems to have a similar problem. Here's some solutions on how to get it fixed, and you'll have a few extra days to pursue those solutions. All right, let's move on.
'Cause that's how real life is,
Yeah,
right? Like, you're gonna have roadblocks, and you're gonna have obstacles, and you're gonna have problems, and you're gonna have to figure out nobody's gonna give you the manual of, like, where do I print this thing? Right? In life, nobody tells you where to print it. You just be like, well, I don't know. I have to figure that
Yeah.
out.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it was really great talking to you both.
Thank you. Yes, it was great to have you as a guest.
All right, well, that will do it from their episode of Behind the Bearcat, and we'll talk to you next time. Hey guys, we hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, be sure to give us a thumbs up below. That helps out. Also, if you've not done so yet, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Also, we'd love to connect with you on social media. You can find Behind the Bearcat on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Plus, the audio podcast comes out on Fridays on all the major podcast platforms. Thanks again for watching Behind the Bearcat, and as always, we'll talk to you next time.